Welcome back to the Racial Draft Podcast, where we change the complexion of the comic book universe one draft pick at a time. I am your host, Michael Ford, on this live stream for the folks who happen to be joining us on Twitter. But if you are listening to us after the fact in podcast land, thank you. You can find us everywhere you find podcasts, including your audio catcher, as well as YouTube. You can also find us by subscribing at various places, racialdraft.com, racial draft at racial draft pod on Twitter, racial.draft on Instagram and Threads, and racial draft on Facebook. We're just going to get right into it. We're recapping 2 rounds of the racial draft dynasty draft for season 7. And it's been a fun couple of rounds, a couple of out of left field picks, but mostly picks that I feel pretty positive about. We don't have a guest so far this week. I mean, maybe we'll get a surprise pop in, but as of yet, it's just going to be me. It's just going to be my takes and my opinions about these picks. So I apologize for wherever the takes may go. But we'll start off with the first pick in the 3rd round of the Dynasty Draft, and that would be Ava Starr, aka Ghost. You might remember her from Ant-Man and the Wasp, where she was depicted as multiracial, but the South Asian delegation went ahead and drafted her, probably having something to do with the fact that Ghost is set to reappear in the MCU as part of the Thunderbolts project. But to that end, just talking about the character kind of in the broadest sense, she was reinvented from a male character named Ghost, who is not, in fact, Ava Starr. But there was some good that was done with how the character was depicted. We have not yet seen this version of Ghost, as I understand it. We have not yet seen this version of Ghost appear in the comics. That does remain to be seen. There are Marvel does occasionally, take steps towards some kind of synergy between the various media. So, that does remain to be seen. And in that sense, it is actually probably positive from a dynasty perspective for the South Asian character to sort of stake their claim to the character, even though the character, like I said, was depicted as multiracial, black and white in the films. But I believe they did put in for a fan cast of Simone Ashley. Is that her name? Give me a second, guys. You might know her if you've been watching Bridgerton. I have not been watching Bridgerton, so yes, Simone Ashley was the fan cast that they chose. Her star is definitely rising. And for me in particular, I would say that she's probably a little overqualified for this role, given that the role is somewhat low profile comparatively speaking. But I really have no objections to either the draft pick or the fan cast. And that does put me, I think, in line with the general public, with 83.3% approval rating for the draft pick. And all 83.3 strongly approving, with only 16.3% racist. With respect to the fan cast, even higher, 90. That's right, 92.3% approval rating for Simone Ashley as Ghost. That's 76.9 strongly approve and 15.4 somewhat approve, with only 7.7 somewhat disapproving of the fan cast. So, generally speaking, that pick went over quite well. And, like I said, there's not a lot of canon reasons why Ghost would need to be, wouldn't be able to be imagined as South Asian, as opposed to what she was in the films. So, right on, so to speak, for the South Asian delegation. Moving on to a pick that's slightly more controversial, I would say. This is a DC character by way of Wildstorm. You might know her as Lady Zana. You might also know her as Zealot from the Wildcats. I believe just the Wildcats. I don't think she was on any of the other Wildstorm teams. Yeah, so from this perspective, knowing what I know about her backstory, it's very Amazon coded, but not quite. She comes from a species of aliens who have also lived on Earth for a long period of time as warrior women akin to the Amazons. I think that in canon, the sort of island that she lived on was in off the coast of Greece. So again, Amazon coded in terms of the mythological basis, but that's about it. In terms of ethnicity, I don't think they're all depicted as white, like traditionally Zealot has been. So for that reason, I think that there's a little bit of leeway, especially culturally, for the Polynesian delegation who made this pick and drafted Zealot to be Polynesian. All that would really require is for their island to be moved a little bit from, I think that's the Mediterranean, from the Mediterranean to the South Pacific. And voila, not too much else of the character changes. So for me personally, I don't think that's such a major canon breaking change. And for that reason, I tend to approve of the pick. That would put me somewhat in line with the public, who was 75% approving and 75 strongly approve, and still 25% racist. But we keep it moving. No need to dilly-dally there. We move on to the Swana MENA delegation, and probably another pick that might be a little controversial given how this character has been depicted. This would be Michael Morbius. He of Morbin time. You might have seen him in the ill-fated film where he was portrayed by Jared Leto. Or you might have seen him in his appearances on the Spider-Man animated series where he would suck your plasma through his hand. But be that as it may, this is Morbius, the living vampire, a doctor, Michael Morbius, who was infected with a disease that mirrors in a lot of ways vampirism, as it is derived from bat venom. And, he's very often depicted as a anti-hero, tragic figure who does occasionally kill because of his bloodlust, but is really out there trying to find a cure. And sometimes that cure may require him to drink Spider-Man's blood, which puts him obviously at odds with the web slinger. But he's had a bit of a spike in popularity, so to speak, because of the aforementioned Morbin time. He may or may not play a role in the upcoming Blood Hunt event in Marvel, Marvel Comics. And again, it still remains to be seen whether we'll see him in other media appearances. So I think there's a little room for him in terms of prominence, and I think that nothing in his backstory suggests that he needs to be Caucasian. And in fact, even the name Michael Morbius is kind of exotic coded, if we're being honest here. Obviously, Morbius could mean Mediterranean sort, kind of white, but something else. And by that, I think that just leaves the door open even more so for the Swana MENA delegation. As we've mentioned before, there's not a lot of representation for characters of Southwest Asian and North African descent. So to the extent that there's a little bit of wiggle room for them, it's a higher degree of difficulty acquisition game for them. But I think this works personally. The people disagree significantly. I would say a 60% approval rating for North African Morbius, with all 60 strongly approving, but still 20% somewhat disapproving and 20% racist. But we move on from Morbius to a character that should be less controversial, but you might be surprised. This would be John Walker, the U.S. agent. You might remember him from Falcon and the Winter Soldier, the television series, where he was played by Wyatt Russell. He too will reoccur. He will be seen once again in the Thunderbolts film, often simply explained as the right-wing Captain America, the Captain America that red state America would like to see. He's a little bit more brash. He's definitely not PC. He goes into darker places and hurts people. And he's not always about bringing the country together as much as he's about fighting for what he depicts, or so what he determines is American interest, even if that's a little bit more jingoistic than we'd like it to be. In a lot of ways, he's what, like I said, he's what red state America kind of imagines Captain America to be, whereas Steve Rogers, in a lot of ways, is what right-thinking, quote-unquote, right-thinking, liberal, progressive folk would like out of their Captain America. Weirdly enough, John Walker doesn't really have anything less than full respect for Steve Rogers. He looks up to him, so it's not that kind of rivalry. His rivalry, I would say, is much more with Sam Wilson. But regardless, to me, perfectly fits within the white delegation. It would be hard, honestly, to imagine John Walker anywhere else. So very strong defensive pick as far as I'm concerned. But a lot of hateration and holleration in his dancery this week, because only 57.1% of the populace approved of a white U.S. agent, which was shocking to me. I mean, I know, again, this is not a popularity contest. This is not saying whether this is your favorite character when we vote on our polls, which, again, you can find at racialdraft.com or Racial Draft Pod on Twitter or racial.draft on Instagram and Threads. But again, when you vote in the poll, remember, you're not voting for whether you like the character. You're voting for whether you think the character is well suited to be portrayed under that particular delegation. So if you say, oh man, this guy, he really is the face of white privilege, he really is the face of everything that's wrong with the hegemony in America, well then he's right where he belongs in the white delegation, as far as I'm concerned. But like I said, only 57.1% of the people agreed with me, which meant 42.9% of the people disagreed with me. I'd love to hear their thoughts as to what John Walker would better be suited. And again, I should mention Racial Draft Podcast at gmail.com was where you could send your longer form thoughts. Maybe you don't want to put your comments in a public forum where they can be scrutinized, and you'd like just to have that additional level of protection, of anonymity, so to speak, of sending an email. So go ahead if you object to certain picks, or if you actually want to expound on why certain picks are really good, hit us up on our email address, and I'll give you the opportunity to have your voice sort of get amplified through the podcast. We will move on from John Walker to a character I would imagine that is a character that most everyone is familiar with, but perhaps maybe not in this form. And that would be the multiracial delegation who has drafted Vlad Dracula. You might know him from the world. I mean, pop culture, he's Dracula. He's the vampire. He is probably going to play a prominent role in the upcoming Blood Hunt event. He has been recently pushed into prominence in the Blade mythos as kind of his frenemy, the leader of the vampire nation. What is there else to say? We all know Dracula. But the question is do we know multiracial Dracula? So bear with me. Let's take a couple steps back. Obviously, we generally think of Dracula as a Eastern European aristocrat. However, a lot of the coding, we'll say, of the character is this idea that his vampirism is somewhat of a curse that has been given to him by Romani peoples. And I would think that there's a little bit of wiggle room in terms of reimagining him as perhaps someone who, doth protest too much in terms of his aristocratic status. He could, in fact, be someone who is being cursed because he's denying his Romani heritage, and this vampirism is in a lot of ways, his burden. I would imagine that's the direction the multiracial delegation would go. I don't think they're imagining him all the way towards, black or, part black rather, or even Native American. I mean, his roots still remain in Europe, and but since we know that there is a substantial overlap with the Romani culture and the Romani people, I think that that's probably the avenue by which his multiracialism can be sort of infused into the character. I think it's an interesting perspective, but I do understand why it would be controversial. So in that sense, I'm not surprised that the approval rating here is only 33.3%, basically a third of the people approve, but 2/3 of the people disapprove of this reimagining, this race bending, if you will, of Vlad Dracula to be part Romani, not pure blood European. Unfortunate, but sometimes you make a pick and then the pick doesn't really pan out. More on that later, I suppose. But moving on from Dracula to the Lord of the Stars. So I can't make this transition work. Yes, Star-Lord, Peter Quill, drafted by the East-Southeast Asian delegation. This is an interesting one because, on one hand, there is something sort of decidedly Midwest, middle brow, white bread about Peter Quill. But on the other hand, maybe that's just because he was played by Chris Pratt, who himself is white bread, middle brow, and a little bit of a goofball. I think that there's a little bit of room if we think about Quill across all pop culture and not just this one depiction. I think he could, as long as he's an American, I think that he can still kind of embody what this character embodies, which is essentially, a maybe Gen X, maybe millennial, depending on how you want to play it, who went out to space and kind of got his life out there in space, living out his sort of Han Solo dream. I hope it's not shocking to know that Americans of all stripes, not just white Americans, looked up to the Star Wars characters. So it wouldn't really be a huge stretch for an Asian American uh, Peter Quill to still want to kind of cosplay as Han Solo out in the realm of space. So for me, I while I definitely understand why it might give some people pause, I think that I think there's a way for East Asian Star Lord to work, and the people they're mixed. 66.6% approval. 2/3 of the way. We almost got there. 58.3 strongly approve, 8.3 somewhat approve, 25% somewhat disapprove. By far the largest, you know, negative reaction, and then the 8.3 racist. But I get it. I mean, it the the Chris Pratt version of Star Lord has loomed so large in the consciousness that it is a big move to go away from that. But I think I think it could happen. I think it could work. But that's just me. Moving on from Peter Quill, we moved to the Jewish delegation. This one's a little chalky, in the fact that the Jewish delegation has drafted this character before, but not so much in the Dynasty Draft. So good on them for drafting a character that they can hold on to for a little longer. But this character is Stephanie Brown, formerly Spoiler, but now one of the Batgirls. If you're not familiar too much with her story, I mean, she has been depicted in live action and also, I believe, in animation. I mean, her major claim to fame is that her father is a supervillain, and she kind of became a superhero as an act of rebellion, in addition to just doing it because it's the right thing. She, I believe she's a genius. Often a lot of these superhero vigilantes are, but I think that she's up there in terms of the like intellectual equals, such as Tim Drake and Barbara Gordon. So she's top tier, potential detective. She's best friends with Sandra Kane, one of the other Batgirls. I'm not sure about her sort of fighting ability. I mean, she's fine. I mean, all the Bat people can fight, but I don't think she's sort of a top tier fighter. She's more of a top tier thinker and top tier detective. And how she's generally been depicted, I think that she could very easily be part of the Jewish delegation with really not much of a change at all to her existing canon. So for me, there's really not a lot of room for objection. So 85.7% approval rating for Jewish Stephanie Brown, Jewish Batgirl / Spoiler. 57.1 strongly approve, 28.6 somewhat approve, and 14.3 somewhat disapprove of the pick. So pretty good, pretty good. But we move on from Stephanie Brown to Brielle Brooks, aka Bloodline. She's a fairly new character. You might also know her as the daughter of Blade. There was quite a lot of backstory about there at one point being a daughter of Blade story. I believe the character's name was Fallon Fox, which never panned out due to some of kind of like behind the scenes shenanigans. Potential objections to a white creator introducing this black woman character, which we've talked about this before, how it's unfortunate that on one hand we want as much diversity as possible, but every now and then there's a pushback to creators that are not of color, sort of taking the creative handle on characters, even characters that they themselves have created. But be that as it may, I don't remember. I want to say Danny Lore created Brielle Brooks, but maybe they just wrote the more prominent run that brought Brielle Brooks, aka Bloodline, to the forefront. But beyond that, I think this is a character that has a good future ahead of her, and I think that the Black delegation, has gotten in on the ground floor of Bloodline, and to the extent that her character continues to progress and continues to become more mainstream, and there have been rumors. We don't know a lot about this upcoming Blade movie, but there have been rumors that Blade's daughter will be in the movie. If this is the case, then Brielle will only become more prominent in pop culture for that. So good on the Black delegation. I think it's a strong pick. I think it's a strong, kind of now and later pick. And we shall see how it sort of plays out in the future. But for now, I approve. And 83.3% of the people approve, which is, again, a little lower than what I would expect, given that this is a character that is already a Black woman. So that 16.7% that is somewhat disapproving of Brielle Brooks remaining Black. Explain yourself. I'd love to hear. I'd love to hear what the objection is to the Black character remaining Black. Speaking of a Black character not remaining Black, our boy, the Skrull himself, James Rhodey Rhodes, aka War Machine, was drafted by the Latinx delegation. Not the first time that this delegation has drafted Rhodey, but every time it happens, it's always a little bit, throws me off a little bit, because this was the Black Iron Man of my childhood, of my youth. He was one of the first high-level Marvel characters that I can remember in the Avengers, even though he was stepping into the shoes of Tony Stark after the sort of Demon in the Bottle storyline. But he managed to parlay his stint of Iron Man into his own armor, War Machine. He hasn't been an A-tier hero, we'll be honest about that, but because of his proximity to Tony, he's always been, not more than a couple steps away. And to that end, he was played by Terrence Howard in the MCU. Then he was, more recently played by Don Cheadle in the MCU. And Don Cheadle's a great performer, and he's managed to portray him with a lot of aplomb, which, notwithstanding the unfortunate development where it was revealed that Rhodey has been, for some undetermined amount of time, in fact, a Skrull. Now, we don't know what the ramifications of that are going to be, but that does put a little bit of a damper in how popular the character is, at least as far as the films are concerned. Obviously, in the comics, like I said, very not much a lead character. Recently, he has been in a on again, off again, mostly on again relationship with Carol Danvers. As a, I wouldn't call them a power couple, but a stable couple of him and I would say that between his appearances in the Captain Marvel book and his appearances in the Iron Man book, he's around, but he's not around as a main character, as a protagonist in his own stories, as much as a supporting character in other stories. How does this connect to the Latinx delegation? Not so sure. Obviously, as we've mentioned before, there are, of course, Afro-Latino people and Afro-Latino characters, but just not sure. Don't hate the pick. Just very curious about how, whether it's a change that serves the character. I mean, obviously, like I said before, Afro-Latino people exist, but for the purposes of the racial draft, when you draft for your delegation, you're drafting that character's primarily identifies themselves with that background. Doesn't really take anything away from Rudy, if we're being honest, to be Latino, but it's just a different way of thinking about him. Obviously, the Don Cheadle version of the character has loomed so large, and he, of course, is not Latino. But I mean, I can't really say I disapprove of the pick. I'm just a little bit less enthused by the pick than I have been by some of the others. But the people are a lot more down on the pick than I expected. The people are sitting here at 35.7% approval rating for Latino Rhodey, 7.1 strongly approve, 28.6 somewhat approve, 35.7 somewhat disapprove, and 28.6% strongly disapprove of Latino Rhodey. So, I think that this the push pull, if you will, when it comes to Rhodey, I think there's a lot of people who feel like no, Rhodey's got to be full on African American, or racism. We'll find out. Again, if you have a take on Rhodey one way or the other, we'd love to hear it. We'd love to talk about it next week's podcast. But we move on to the final pick of the third round, and that comes from the Native American delegation. They went ahead and drafted a character who was conceived of as a Native American. This is Werewolf by Night, Jake Gomez version of Werewolf by Night, not the Jack Russell version. He hasn't had a lot of stories, but the stories that we have read definitely tie in the extent to which his anger at how his community has been mistreated sort of fuels his werewolf energy. It's been a while since I read that first run. I know he's going to get another run sometime in the future, in the near future. But yeah, I mean, there's really no reason for me to object to a Native American character remaining Native American, particularly given the paucity of Native American characters in comics, which is why it's kind of disappointing that the approval rating for this pick is only at 62.5%. Now, granted, all 62.5 are strongly approving, but there's 25% somewhat disapproving and 12.5 strongly disapproving of the Native American Werewolf by Night remaining Native American. So, that's disheartening. Do better, people. Do better. But that's it for the third round. Now, the fourth round, which we're moving into shortly, that's interesting because the polls are still open there, which means I'll be giving you poll results, but you have more than enough time, especially those of you who are listening live on Twitter, to get over there to Racial Draft Pod on Twitter and get your votes in and raise up some of these approvals or bring them down if you disapprove. Hopefully, these are picks that you do approve, but we'll find out. And starting us off is the Native American delegation, the aforementioned. This pick could be considered controversial, but it's a pick that they've made before. I like it. And this pick is Groot to be Native American. Now, granted, as a caveat, Groot is an alien character. So one might ask, like, how can an alien character, be Native American? And I think that's fair. I think that this is a character that is also, though, also represents the land, also represents the, as a tree character. I think that there's a little bit of wiggle room, given that his origins are of a seed, and there's certain mythological figures that whose origins come from beyond the stars. I think there's a way that there can be a conflation of Groot species with a particular nation or tribe somewhere in the States. But again, it involves a little bit of a reimagining, but not so much that I think it couldn't work. However, definitely a minority opinion if I'm looking here at the approval rating. Obviously, there's time if you disagree, but 28.8% is the approval rating right now for a Native American group, with 42.9 somewhat disapproving and 28.6 strongly disapproving of a group being a Native American. But I would want to ask to the people who are disapproving, what race would you prefer Groot to be? Given that he's a tree. I'm sure that Scarlett Johansson has some thoughts, but other than her, I'd love to hear yours. But we move on from Groot to the Latinx delegation, and the Latinx delegation has drafted an Asgardian. Not the first Asgardian this season. They drafted Thor a little earlier. Obviously, this is something that came up before when we talked about Asgard being sort of part of Norse mythology. It just raises questions for me. Not necessarily me saying that it couldn't work, but it does raise questions as to what it would mean for Sif to identify as Latina, especially given that the Asgardian culture precedes colonialism, precedes the what's the word I'm looking for? The exploration of the New World by the European powers, which kind of created different cultures, different Latinx cultures. So I think that there's a little bit of narrative work that has to be done in terms of kind of creating that bond or creating that link with respect to Asgardian culture and any kind of Latinx culture. I mean, it's not impossible, but I think that I think some work to be done here. So I'd love to hear it, but until then, it's kind of, for me, it's a needs, there's to be continued in terms of spelling that out. But if you listeners, if you feel otherwise, if you feel strongly for either approving or disapproving of the pick, go ahead, hit up the Twitter poll, or racialdraft.com, and cast your vote as to whether you approve or disapprove of Latina Lady Sif. For me, I'm a little befuddled, so it's tough for me either way to have a strong opinion, but maybe you all feel differently. We will move on, though, from Latina Lady Sif to another defensive pick by the Black delegation. This is a fairly new character, Ida Okonkwo. She used to be called Oya. Now she's called Temper. She's best understood as, what if Iceman and Human Torch were in the same individual? I don't know a lot more about her character, kind of beyond that. She's a Nigerian mutant who was discovered in the aftermath of the decimation. She's one of the first new mutants after that happened, where the infamous No More Mutants situation. She's about to play a prominent role in one of the X-Men teams from the Ashes era of the X-Men, post Krakoa. There's a little bit of, there's not a ton of Black female characters in the mutant mythos, so there's a little bit of room for her story to continue to be told, and there's a lot of room for her to show up in other forms of media, given that those of us who love Avatar: The Last Airbender, we're getting a firebender and an icebender in one individual. So yeah, I want to see where Temper's future goes, but it does make sense that the Black delegation has staked their claim, for her and her future. So for me, it's an approval. It's a strong approval, but I'm shocked to find out that we're only 50-50, with 50% strongly approving and 50% somewhat disapproving of Nagoya remaining Black. So this is one of those situations where I gotta point the finger at you listeners and say you gotta get those votes in. You gotta up that 50-50 for the Black character staying Black. That sounds like misogynoir. Sounds like misogynoir. Don't fall victim to that. But moving on from misogynoir to something decidedly different, and that is the Jewish delegation, Mary Marvel, who I'm shocked was still out there to be drafted. This is another character that really there's not a lot of reason that this character couldn't be Jewish. There's not a lot to be said. I mean, she could be Jewish. There's, in fact, there's really nothing in her canon that suggests that it would break the character if she was Jewish. Obviously, visually, there are actresses, there are women, young women who look the part, who look like the way that Mary Batson or Mary Bromfeld would look. So, my hands are tied here. I really have no reason to have a problem with it. And it seems like the people agree, as they're at 100% approval rating for Jewish Mary Marvel, with all 100 strongly approving. So let's move on from there, because it's not really that much to be said. However, we will move on to another defensive pick. Another character doesn't really have a lot to be said, and that is Yuriko Oyama, Lady Deathstrike. You might have remembered her from The Wolverine, where she was criminally underused. You might also know her from comics, where she tends to be criminally underused. She's a villain, but there have been times where she sort of flirted with the edge of being an anti-hero. I would like to see them kind of develop this character further. There's a rumor, well, not so much a rumor as much as confirmed leak based on the trailer, that her character is going to return in the Deadpool movie. But beyond that, maybe small appearance in the movies. I'd like to know, again, a paucity of East Asian characters in comics, particularly in the X-Men mythos, where the infamous, I'm blanking on the name of the editor who used an Asian pseudonym to write stories that are Asian tinged. For that reason alone, characters like Lady Deathstrike need to be fleshed out more. I want to say Akira Yoshida. Is that right? Is that what is what? Anyway, the important thing is that, notwithstanding Akira Yoshida, Yuriko Oyama, Lady Deathstrike, needs to get a little bit more exposure. But again, no bearing on whether you should approve of this East Asian character remaining East Asian. As of right now, 87.5% approve, which means there's still 12.5% that somewhat disapproves, and I don't get it. So, listeners, you've got time. Get over there to racialdraft.com. Get over there to Racial Draft Pod on Twitter, and get your approval votes in, because this should not stand. But we move on from one defensive pick to, one might call this an offensive pick, but hear me out here. So this is the multiracial delegation, and the racial delegation. Often, I call them the skeleton key delegation because they have a lot of leeway in terms of where they can reimagine characters, even if a character has been traditionally depicted one way. But this character has ruffled some feathers because this is Eric Killmonger. That's right. He of the Is This Your King? He of the original Black Panther. He of the Michael B. Jordan. He was reimagined by the multiracial delegation to be both Black and Middle East North African. And personally, I think that this is an intriguing way of reimagining the character. This is a character who is all about revolution, all about standing up for marginalized people, uh, not just marginalized people, but people who are part of the global South. He's anti-colonialist. Well, the version of Killmonger that we got in the Black Panther film was anti-colonialist. Now, granted, his approach was very problematic, and in fact, when you peel back the surface just a little bit, even though he was shaped by these revolutionary radical forces, uh, a he served the CIA, which meant that he did a lot of dirt all over the world and killed a lot of people, probably at the behest, well, not probably at the behest of the government, but probably good people, probably innocent people. And, to the extent that destabilizing governments is something that the US does quite a bit. You know where they do a lot of their destabilizing? That's right, the Middle East and North Africa. And I think that in terms of giving this character a little bit more depth, he's not just standing up for African people, for people of African descent. He's also standing up for people of Arab and Middle Eastern descent who feel put upon by colonial forces, who feel occupied by the Western world, by different countries, and might be particularly driven towards radical. One might call them terrorists, but at least tactics that would run afoul of things that we approve of. And because he believes he's righteous, because he believes he's on the right side, he's willing to cross quite a few lines for that. Now, how this tracks with the comic book version of Killmonger in recent years, that character has been infused with the same sort of revolutionary ideology and rhetoric that we've seen in that Michael B. Jordan portrayal of the character, which again, very influenced by the idea that the Western powers and the colonials, the colonizers of the world have taken resources from different places. And again, there are a lot of people in that part of the world who feel that way, even to this day, about the forces of the West, particularly America, and what they've done to the common people. So if he's all about revolution, even though misguided revolution, I think that it's very resonant to the geopolitics of the day of the last few years. That Killmonger not just be about Black revolution and Black radicalism, but also radicalism in the Middle East and North Africa. So for me, I like it. For me, I like it quite a bit. But the people, they don't agree. The people are, they're 33.3% approval, and then 66.7 disapproval, with 50% somewhat disapproving and 16.7 strongly disapproving. So, I'm in the minority here, but I think it's kind of cool. I think it'd be kind of cool way of, fleshing Killmonger out even more. And not to mention, those of us in the Black community do know that sometimes, the not fully Black people in our community go even harder for Black liberation. So all the more reason that a half Wakandan Killmonger would feel like he had even more to prove. Anyhow, we move on from Killmonger to Rachel Summers from the White Delegation. You might remember, if you are a longtime listener, that the White Delegation earlier in the season drafted Jean Grey. They also drafted Madeline Pryor. This is her, well, specifically Jean Grey's daughter from an alternate timeline. Again, this is kind of chalky. This is a character that has traditionally been depicted as white, that could still be depicted as white, and really doesn't change anything. Which is why I'm shocked that the approval rating here is only 33%, with 33% somewhat disapproving and 33% strongly disapproving. So I'd love to hear from the disapprovers as to why it is that they feel like Rachel Summers is better suited as not white. Because I'm a little baffled, honestly. But there's a lot of time, listeners. If you'd like to get in there and upvote the approval for white Rachel Summers to something that seems to make a little bit more sense, go ahead and do that. RacialDraft.com, RacialDraftPod on Twitter. I'm shocked at how low that approval rating is here. Never know. Never really know. This one is another defensive pick. This is a newer character. And, if you've been reading the Miles Morales Spider-Man series, you've been introduced to a character named Ranim Rashad, aka Rabble, who is of Jordanian descent. Her villain origin story, is that she did not make it to the Brooklyn Vision Academy that Miles Morales did, and believes that she deserves it more than Miles. And because of that, her opportunities were limited. Because of that, she doesn't feel like Miles has done as much with the opportunity that she could have done. And I think it's an interesting motivation for a villain, that someone who feels like the hero has taken an opportunity that belonged to them and done less with it than they believe that they deserve, and has taken it upon herself over the last few issues to enact her revenge, show how superior she is to Miles, as the villain Rabble. I think that there's still more to be told in this story. I think that to the extent that Miles has been sort of, a lot of people had criticized Miles for not having kind of his own organic rogues gallery, having a character like Rabble, who has a very unique and very pointed rationale for hating Miles, even as Miles tries to, in its true Spider-Man fashion, try to talk her down into a less problematic and less it's not self-destructive, but less socially destructive paths. She continues to kind of descend into villainy. I think it's an interesting character with interesting motivation. I think the fact that she is of Jordanian descent, that she's from a first-generation immigrant, who's trying to kind of make a better life for herself. I think that kind of touches on a lot of what you see in terms of conflicts between different immigrant groups, particularly when it comes to Black people. Certain immigrant groups feeling like they could do more with opportunities. Obviously not fully political, but just the idea that it was hard for them. and they came to America for a better life, and they want that better life, and they see certain people in other communities not taking advantage of it. I think it's a lot there. I think that for the Swanamena delegation, there's a character who's already represents that ethnicity, and yeah, I mean it's a good pick at a good time, which is why I am shocked that there's only 50% approval rating for Rabble sort of remaining member of the Swanamena delegation. So again, I urge you listeners to get in there, get your votes in, cast your positive votes and get those up, because I mean I can't really see the rationale for the disapproval. 50% strongly approve, 25% somewhat disapprove, and 25% strongly disapprove. And strong disapprove is even more galling, honestly. So we move on. Coming up close to the end of the round, and that brings us to definitely one of the picks that kind of came a little out of left field, I think, but I think it could work. We're talking about you might know him as Quentin Quire, but did you actually know that his full name is Quintavious Quirinius Quire? That's right, Quintavious Quirinius Quire. Yeah, I was as shocked as you when I looked that up, but yeah, Quentin Quire, obviously traditionally depicted as white, but when you really look at it, kind of looking at his story, he's a little snarky. He's a little bit irreverent, to say the least, particularly when it comes to his t-shirt choices. But he's very much of a piece with, I would say, Gen Z, and is more militant when it comes to mutant revolution and the desire to kind of stand up for mutants and for mutants' rights. He to the extent that earlier in the season, the Polynesian delegation drafted Professor X, who was very much about the respectability politics side of being a mutant and showing in the world that this world that hates and fears you, that there's nothing to hate or to fear. There's more of a defiance in Quire, who has a lot of the same powers as Professor X, and in a lot of ways could be seen as kind of the next generation Professor X. But with him, he's not. I mean, yes, he does wear the Magneto was right shirt quite a bit, but I think that he's not as far, at least not all the time. He's not as far into the supremacy side as Magneto is, but he does believe, that mutants don't have anything to apologize for, that they don't have anything to, cower about, prove. They don't have anything to prove to baseline humans, and for that end, I think that does kind of code him as a person of color, and I think that does kind of give a room. Open the door for the Polynesian delegation to get them a taste of Quire. I don't think it breaks the character at all for him to be Polynesian. Um, you know, any person of color for that matter. So, I think it could work. I don't have an issue with it. Perhaps there's a case to be made that he should be white, at least white passing. I'm willing to entertain. That discussion, that he does still have some residual privilege, and that allows him to be such a firebrand, so outspoken. I'm willing to entertain that, but again, there are a lot of Polynesians who do kind of skew more towards white passing. So I think that even that kind of gives him the leeway to be that for the Polynesian delegation. So for me, I'm on the approval train. But the people, they're a lot more mixed than I am. They are at 55.5% approval rating when it comes to Quentin Quire, Kid Omega in the Polynesian delegation. I don't actually know how you feel, people. So I'd love to know. I'd love to find out. Love to, you know, get out there. Racialdraft.com, Racial Draft Pod on Twitter. Get those votes in. Get those votes up. Spread it. Start a conversation. You know, because this is a character that I think is going to play more of a role going forward. I can certainly see this character being a bigger deal once the X-Men come to the MCU. He's been kind of on the verge of breaking out, but I think that he, you know, once the spotlight of the MCU is shined on him, I think that's when we'll really see what his upside, Quentin Quire's upside of a character will be. So it remains to be seen, but to be continued with respect to Quentin Quire. And that brings us to the final pick of the round, and that is Negasonic Teenage Warhead, who most of us, I would say, have been introduced to through the Deadpool movies. Obviously, she appeared in comics before that. She had died, come back. She was Genoshan. Her power set was much different than what she was in the Deadpool movies, and I think they've since kind of tried to bring her definitely visually more in line with how she was depicted in Deadpool, but perhaps even in terms of powers, but not yet, not quite yet. However, I think that there's, depending on how things go with the Deadpool film, I think that we'll see, you know, potentially more of her in the comics. She had a recent run in the Marvel Infinity Comics, the digital comics that you might find on Marvel Unlimited. However, I don't think there's anything about the character that is, you know, even though she's been traditionally depicted as, you know, white passing, I think that the South Asian delegation who drafted her, there's no reason that her being South Asian, you know, as opposed to white, would somehow hamper the storytelling around the character. You know, this would be a character that just happens to be white, just like how if racially drafted, this character would just happen to be South Asian. You know, I think that there's pretty blank canvas with respect to her stories. So, you know, I can't really have a valid objection to the race bend of Negasonic to South Asian. But, you know, people, you might feel differently. I'd love to hear it if you do. Love to hear why, rather. But as of now, 75% approval rating for South Asian Negasonic Teenage Warhead. So, again, racialdraft.com or Racial Draft Pod on Twitter. Get your votes in. We can find out ultimately where the people, you know, sit on this. Like I said, I'm in the camp of approving, but maybe you feel differently, and if so, you know, go ahead, state your case in the comments or state your case on the email, racialdraftpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you because, you know, this is, by and large, this is supposed to be about starting a discussion. It's supposed to be about talking about what makes these characters tick and why these characters are stronger, depicted, you know, one way versus another way. And, you know, how I can't always cover both sides of a discussion by myself. We'd love to have some more guests in here, and I will be efforting to do that in the future, getting more guests, getting a more robust discussion about the characters. But, you know, this week we covered 2 rounds. We got in, you know, some summaries about these characters, but not a lot more that I can add this week. Hopefully next week we will kick off, when we kick off the 5th round. There'll be some picks, there'll be some food for thought, and you can join us next week. Same race time, same race channel. But until then, all things are possible.